Hey everyone, welcome to Data Millennials. I'm Atul, and in this video we are going to see how we can create and customize pivot tables with bar in our Looker dashboard. You have most often heard and mostly used pivot table in Excel, but Looker provides you the functionality to create and customize the pivot table to narrow down a large data set or analyze relationship between data points. Pivot tables reorganize your dimension and matrices to help you quickly summarize your data and see relationships that might otherwise be hard to spot. So we will be creating this pivot table which you can see on your screen from scratch in this video. But before we go ahead and start creating this pivot table, let's first discuss what exactly a pivot table is and how it can be useful in your dashboard. A pivot table is a statistical tool that summarizes and reorganizes selected columns and rows of data in a Looker table to obtain a desired report. The tool does not actually change the data itself, it simply pivots or turns the data to view it from different perspective. So as you can see over here, I have a raw data which I have used in my pivot table. So I have country code, number of items sold, date and revenue in millions. So this is a raw data. From this raw data, it's very difficult to understand a pattern or understand or recognize a relationship. But if you see this pivot table, what this pivot table has done is that it simply turns the data to another view from different perspective, and it shows data date wise for each country, the number of items sold and revenue in millions. And as we can see that if the number of items sold is greater, then the revenue will also be greater. If it is less, then the revenue in millions will also be less. So it's easy to understand a relationship from pivot table as compared to the raw data. So pivot tables are specifically used with large amount of data that would be time consuming to calculate manually or by hand. A few data processing functions a pivot table can perform include identifying sum, average, range or outliers. So you can identify the outliers by seeing the pivot table. The table then arranges this information in a simple meaningful layout that draws the attention to the key values. So whenever you see a pivot table, the first thing that draws your attention is the high values. The pivot table is very useful in identifying the outliers or to identifying the relationship between multiple fields. Now the question that should come into your mind is that how pivot table works and how can we create it. So pivot table in Looker takes the row as a standard table and pivot them so they become columns. This lets you group and summarize the data in ways a standard table cannot provide. So when we create a pivot table, there are four main components of it. The first component is columns. When a field is chosen for column area, the only unique values of the fields are listed across the top. So for example, when I have selected this country code ISO 2 as a column, as I can see, count is 45. This means I have 44 records with country names. So this column, when I select it as a column in my pivot table, only two records are showing, India and Bahrain, IN and BH, which is Bahrain. So the pivot table will only show the unique values listed across the top. Then the second component is row. When a field, for example, this date we have selected as row. So when a field is chosen for row area, it populates the first column, which is over here, the first column. Similar to the columns, all rows label are unique values and removed duplicate. So the pivot table will remove duplicate from your raw data and show the unique values in the first column when you select it as a row. Then the third main component of pivot table is values, and each value in pivot table is kept in a cell and displays the summarized information. So these are the summarized information. It can be either sum, average, minimum, maximum or other aggregate function. Now the last or the fourth main component of pivot table is filter. Filters apply a calculation or restriction to the entire table. So whenever you want to either include or exclude something in your pivot table, then you can use this filter option. So this pivot table is a standard table listing the day on day sales, quantity and revenue in millions by each country. While this table is useful for showing which country has the most revenue and the high quantity of sales, it is useful for summarizing this data in a meaningful way. A pivot table, however, quickly shows the relationship of this data. This table easily summarizes the data, and you can also quickly spot outliers or anomalies in your data. So pivot table in Looker supports adding multiple rows and column dimensions, which further breaks down the data, giving you even more insight into your data. So let's go and create a pivot table just like this that you can see on your screen from scratch as an example. So what I'm going to do over here is that I'm going to click on edit so that I can get into edit mode, and then I'm going to add a page so that in this new page I will show you how you can create this pivot table with bars from scratch. So I'll copy this header and put it over here. Then the first thing that you would need to create a pivot table with bars is your data source. If you have already added your data source, then you will be able to add pivot table with bars. But if you have not added your data source, then you can go to resources and click on manage added data source, then click on add a data source, and it will take you to the Looker Google connector page, and you can connect any of these connectors and load your data into Looker. So for us, we already have this data, pivot data, which I have shown you earlier. So we will be creating the pivot table using this data, and we will try to replicate this pivot table which I have shown you. So once your data is added, then you can go and click on add a chart. Then you have to scroll down, and under this pivot table you have to select the second option, pivot table with bar. Once you click on it, then Looker will allow you to add a pivot table with bar in your page. And once this widget is ready, this pivot table with bar widget is ready, you will see that Looker by default has selected some of the row dimension, column dimension, matrices over here by default. So what we are going to do is that we are going to discuss about each and every option that is present over here in setup as well as in style, and simultaneously we will be replicating or we will be updating this pivot table to show or replicate the one which I have shown you over here, which is in my page 1 of this GDS 34. Okay, so the first thing that we have over here is setup. So this setup option in a chart setup panel determines how the data is organized and displayed. And within the setup, the first option is data source. So a data source provides the connection between the component and the underlying data set. So for us, the component is this pivot table with bar, and the underlying data is coming from this data source. Now suppose if you have added 3 or 4 or n number of data sources and you want to change your data source for this pivot table, what you can do is that you can simply click over here and select any of your added data source or any available data source. Now if you want to create this pivot table with a new data source, then you can click over here, add a data, and you will see this Google connectors. You can select any of the connector and add the data, and then you will be able to show the pivot table with the data which you have just added. Now the next option in setup is date range dimension. So this option appears if your data source has a valid date dimension. The date range dimension is used as a basis for limiting the date range of the pivot. For example, if you are a viewer or an editor of the report and you use a date range control to limit the time frame, then the user will only be able to see the data in the pivot of the selected date range. And as I have told, this option appears if a data source has a valid date dimension. As you can see over here, I have a date column which has correct date format values. So by default, Looker has taken this date column and assigned it in the date range dimension. Now the next option that we have over here within setup is row dimension. So before we discuss this row dimension, first let's try to understand what exactly is dimension. So dimensions are the data categories. The dimension values are the data contained by the dimension, such as names, description, or other characteristics of a category. Now this row dimension provides the breakdown of rows in the pivot table. So for example, I want to show dates on each of the row first, so I have to select date over here. Now if you want to add another dimension, you can add another dimension over here. For example, I can add country code ISO 2. Similarly, you can add n number of row dimension based on what kind of data you are using. So we do not need this country code ISO2 over here, so we'll remove this and we'll only keep date. Now within this row dimension you will see this option expand and collapse. So if you turn on this expand and collapse, then it will treat the row dimension as an expandable hierarchy. The order in which you list the dimension within this hierarchy matters. As a rule of thumb, you should define hierarchy to always go from most general to most specific. For example, defining a geographic hierarchy such as continent, subcontinent, country, state, city, district could provide a desirable result. So as I have turned on this expand collapse, you will see that the hierarchy has been created by Looker by default because I'm using date. So what the hierarchy is year. Then within a year there will be 12 months. The second hierarchy is month. Then within months we will have dates. So this is the appropriate hierarchy or the correct hierarchy. And whenever you are using this expand or collapse, you should always maintain hierarchy to get the desirable result. For us, we do not require this hierarchy, or we do not require this expand and collapse, so we are going to remove these things and we'll only keep date in our row dimension. The next option that we have over here is column dimension. So the column dimension provides the columns in the pivot table. We can reorder the dimension list to change the order of the column in our table. So as you can see over here, by default Looker has selected date in column dimension. But what we need in column dimension, we needed country over here, so that we can see for each country what was the number of items sold and what was the revenue generated from them. So we'll select country over here, country code ISO2, and we have two countries over here, BH for Bahrain and IN for India. Now if you want to add another column dimension, you can click on this add dimension and you can add n number of column dimensions. Now the next option that we have is metric. So the metric measures the thing contained in dimension and provide the metric scale and data series for the chart. Mostly metrics are aggregation that come from the underlying data set or that are the result of the implicit or explicitly applying an aggregation function such as count, sum or average. So as you can see over here, we are seeing a small bar, right? And when I keep my mouse over here, then I will be able to see the number 2. So this is the record count. So this 2 is a numeric scale which we are obtaining from this record count as a metric. So instead of this record count, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to select number of items sold as my first metric, and then I'm going to select revenue in millions as my second metric, so that I can understand and identify if there is any kind of relationship between number of items sold and revenue that is generated from that items. Now there is an option of optional metrics. So with this optional metrics, we can define a list of additional matrices that we can display on our table. So for example, as you can see over here, we have two matrices. Now suppose if I want to show the number of record also, then what I can do? I can add number of record here, right? But what happens is that there are some of the matrices which you want to show for some of the specific users. For wider user, you just want to show these two matrices, and there is some specific user who also wants to see the record count. Then in that case, what you can do is that you can remove it from here and you can click on optional matrices and turn it on and select this metric record count. Now if I go to view, then you will see that we have only two matrices over here, number of items sold in 1000 and revenue in millions. Now if I come over here, then I will be able to select this optional metric option, and if I click on it, then I will be able to select this record count. So this is the functionality of optional metrics. You can select this optional metrics as a viewer. So let's remove this now and click on edit to see more options in the setup section. Now we have an option of totals here. So it displays the total for each row and column. So if you have only one dimension in a row or column, the option will always display a grand total, as you can see here. But if you have two or more dimensions, then this option includes subtotal and grand totals. So as you can see, I have only one dimension, country, and one column dimension and one row dimension as date. I do not have more than one dimensions. So by default, Looker is showing us totals as row total and column total as a grand total. But if we have more than one dimension, or even if we have two dimensions, then the option will include the subtotals for each and every dimension. So if you want to show the row total or the grand total of rows, you can select this option. Similarly, if you want to show the column grand totals, you can select this option. Okay. Then the next option that we have is sorting. So this sorting option lets you control the order of the data displayed in the pivot table. In addition, you can limit the number of rows and column displayed. So now I have one row dimension and one column dimension. That's why I have row 1. I can select the sorting based on my date in ascending order, and then for column I can select revenue in millions and put it as ascending, or let's keep it at descending. Okay. Now the next option that we have over here is default date range. So this default date range is used as a basis for limiting the date range of this pivot table. For example, if you select a date range, then it will limit the time frame for this entire pivot data. So you have two options over here. The first option is auto and the second option is custom. This auto uses the default date range determined by the data source, and the second option, custom, lets you use the calendar widget to select a custom date range for the pivot table. So if I click over here, then I will have a calendar widget and I will have different options over here from which I can select to show the data on my pivot table. So let's select this last 7 days for example and click on apply. Then you will see that your pivot table will show only last 7 days as of today. So it's better to select auto so that your user can have an option to select the date range based on their requirement. Now the last option in setup is filter. So filter restrict the data that is displayed in the component, which is pivot table over here, by including or excluding the values you want to specify. For example, if you want to add a filter for inclusion or exclusion of a particular value, then what you can do over here is that you can click on add a filter, and then you have to click on create a filter. Then you will be able to add a filter. So the first thing that you need to do is that you need to put the name of the filter here, so that whenever you open your dashboard and edit your dashboard in future, you will be able to understand what kind of filtration you have applied in past by reading this name. Then after adding this name, what you can do is that you can select either include or exclude. Then you can select a field on which you want to apply filter. Then you have to select a condition, and then you have to give values over here and click on save. So for us, we are not going to add any filtration because we want to show all the data in our pivot table. So filter was the last option in setup. Now we'll discuss about the style option. Before we go ahead and discuss the style option, let's click on view and see our pivot table. So you can see this pivot table, right? And when you see this pivot table, you will be able to analyze your data and you will be able to understand or recognize some pattern, as well as the relationship between number of items sold and the revenue in millions. So you can see that whenever the number of items sold is higher, revenue is also higher. Whenever it's lower, revenue is also lower. As you see this pivot table, you may think that we can make this pivot table more visually appealing. And to make this pivot table more visually appealing, we have to use the style property of this pivot table. So let's go and discuss about the style property. So a style property is the chart's property which controls the overall presentation and appearance of the chart. And the first option within this style property is conditional formatting. So this conditional formatting allows you to format your table based on certain condition of rules. So if you want to apply a conditional formatting, then you can click over here on add, and then you have three options: color type, format rules, and color and style. So you can select any of these two options from here, single color or color scale. So suppose if I select single color, then you have to go to format rules and you have to select either metric, row, column, or any on which you want to apply these rules. Then you have to select a field, and then you have to select a condition over here, and you have to put a value over here. Okay, once you have given a value, for example, let's say I gave 10, then I can select the color and style from here. This is the background color and this is the font color. But as we are using pivot table with bar, I do not want to create any conditional formatting because it will look very complex. So the next option in style that we have is table header. So these options control the appearance of data label, and the first option in table header is the header font color. It changes the font color of the table header. So let's change it to yellow, or let's make it black only. Now the next option that we have over here is header font size. It changes the font size of the table header. So if you want to increase or decrease the font size, you can select it from here. And the last option in table header is the header font family. It changes the font family of the table header. So we can change the font family from here. Now the next option that we have is table colors. These options control the color of the table border and cells. And the first option that we have over here is header background color. It sets the color of the table header background. So suppose if I want to change it to white, I can change it to white. Now the next option that we have is cell border color. It sets the color of the border between the rows. So if I select it red, you will see all the cells over here, cell border has changed to red. Now the next option that we have over here is highlight color. It sets the color of the highlighted bar. So when I'm saying highlighted bar, if I come here and put my mouse on this row on 9th January, you will see that the highlighted color is gray. Now if you want to change it, you can change it from here, and let's select red. Okay. Now the next option that we have over here is odd row color or even row color. It sets the color of the odd and even rows in the table. So if you want to change the color of odd rows of one color and put the even rows of one color, you can do it from here. So let's undo this. Okay. Now the next option within a style that we have is table label. These options control the appearance of your table labels. The first option that we have over here is font color. It sets the font color of the data. So let's keep it as blue. Okay. Now the next option that we have is the font size. It sets the font size of your data. Let's keep it at 16. And the last option that we have is the font family. It sets the font family of the data. So let's keep Tahoma over here. Okay. Now the next option that we have over here is the missing data. So this option controls how to display missing values. For example, when data is missing from the table, you can choose to show blank, hyphen, or any other word. For example, you have multiple options over here. If your data has missing value, then you can either show it as no data, 0, dash, null, or blank. Then we have this metric option. So this section controls the appearance of the matrices. So for example, our first metric was number of items sold over here. Now if you want to change the color, you can change the color from here. Suppose I want to show it using this blue color, okay, or some sort of blue color. Now if you want to show numbers, you can select this show numbers, and the number will be start appearing over here. Now if you want to change the number format, for example, if you want to make it compact, you can use this compact number, as it rounds the number and displays the unit indicator. For example, suppose you have a number over here which says 100,000, and if you check this compact number, what will happen is that it will make the 100,000 and show it as 100k. For example, you can see over here it's showing 1.4k, it's showing 2.4k. Now the next option over here is decimal precision. It sets the number of decimal places for metrics. So for example, number of items sold cannot be in decimals, so we'll always select it as 0. Okay. Now bar scaling. You have an option to select the bar scaling, whether you want to start it at 0 or relative to the data range. So it's if you select it to 0, what will happen is that the bar starts with 0, and when you select related to data range, then looker will basically the looker will automatically define the range based on your data, and it will plot this bar. So let's select start at 0. Okay, now the next option that we have is metric 2. As we have two metrics over here, number of items sold and revenue, that's why we have two metric over here, metric 1 and metric 2. Now if you have 5 metric or 6 metric, then you will have the n number of matrices over here, and you have to select those matrices and change the features. So the options are same over here. For metric 2 also, we'll select the pub color or bar color over here, then we will show the number, and then as revenue in millions is money, so we'll select decimal place 2. Okay, we'll show compact numbers at 2, and we'll start at 0. Okay, now the next option within style is background and border. So this option controls the appearance of the chart background container. The first option that we have over here is the background. It sets the chart background color. So suppose I want to set the chart background color as this, so I can select it, or let's keep some other color like this. Okay, now the next option that we have is the border radius. So it adds the rounded border to your chart background. When the radius is 0 over here, the background shape has 90-degree corners over here, 90-degree corners. Now if the border radius is 100, it produces a circular radius. As you can see, I have selected 100 over here, and it produces circular radius. Now the next option that we have over here is opacity. It sets the chart opacity. 100% opacity completely hides the object behind the chart, and 0% opacity makes the chart invisible. So it's always suggested that you should always select either 90% or 100% of opacity for your chart or any of the visualization widget. The next option that we have over here is border color. It sets the chart border color. So let's select the border color as red. Then we have this border weight. It sets the chart border line thickness. So let's keep it at 5. And the last option that we have over here, or second last option that we have over here, is border style. It sets the chart border style. You have 4 options: solid, that we are using right now, then you have dashed, then you have dotted, and you have double. So let's keep double. And the last option that we have is add border shadow. It adds a shadow to the chart lower and right borders. So let's go and click on view to see our pivot table over here. Okay, using this pivot table, you can see that there is a relationship between the number of items sold and revenue, and using these bars, it's easy for us to understand the relationship between these two columns. So as you have created this pivot table from scratch, you need to know one more thing about pivot table, and that is the limitations. There are certain limitations of pivot table. The first limitation is that the pivot table can process up to 50,000 rows of data. However, depending on the data set and dimensions as well as matrices involved in the table, performance may degrade. So suppose if you have 60,000 or 80,000 data and you have created the pivot table, then the performance of your report will be degraded. So you can apply a filter to the pivot table to reduce the amount of data which is being processed. Now the next limitation is that you may have up to 5 pivot table per page in a report. So you cannot add more than 5 pivot table in a particular page in a report. The next limitation is that the number of rows dimension available depend upon the type of data you have connected to. For example, if you connect to Google Ads or Google Analytics, then you can have up to 5 row dimension. But if you connect it to Google Sheet and BigQuery, then you can have up to 10 row dimension. The next limitation is that pivot table can have up to 2 column dimensions only. Then the next limitation is that the pivot table can have up to 10 matrices. There is a limitation with the appearance of pivot table, and that is the pivot table do not have paginate option, so you cannot have a page number over here in your pivot table as you have in your standard tables. And the last limitation of pivot table is that you cannot apply metric filters to your pivot table. And if you try to do that, then it will show you an error message. So these are the limitations of pivot table, but pivot table has a lot more advantage as it helps us to understand the relationship between our variables, and it helps us to understand our data and put it into much more visually appealing way. So this is how you can create and customize pivot table with bars in Looker or in Data Studio. Happy learning and see you in the next video.